The Feudal Future Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Feudal Future Podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And, Joel, we're a podcast that focuses largely on the unintended consequences of economic and political policies. And today, we're going to tackle the unintended consequences of EVs, both on the distribution channel for cars, the car dealers, as well as the other issues related to how do you actually fuel them, refuel them, and deal with the energy grid. And to help us do that, we have two really wonderful guests. First is Jamie Farley. Jamie is a partner at Performance Brokerage Services, which is the largest brokerage of auto dealerships in the world. And she also is a 20-year veteran of Toyota's dealership management system. So Jamie, welcome. And we have Mark Mills, who is Executive Director of the National Center for Energy Analytics. And he focuses on the science and economics of energy and technology policy. Thank you very much for joining us, Mark and Jamie. And Joel, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, one of the things that's been interesting to me is this EV mandate seems to have, in many ways, created a great deal of controversy and a sort of a gap between what the policymakers want and what the consumer wants. So maybe, Jamie, we could start with you. What are you seeing in the marketplace? I mean, we're in a state like California, we're already being shoved in this direction. But what is the consumer saying to you?
Absolutely. There's a big gap and there's a tremendous push right now, and it's not meeting up with what the consumers are wanting right now. And I think it's important to set the stage of what EV growth actually looks like. So it has seen rapid growth, but it still only accounted for 6% of new vehicle sales in 2023. And when we look at the total landscape of EVs and what's out there on the road, they only make up 1% of our units in operation. So it's still a very, very small piece of what's actually out there in terms of vehicles. Is it growing fast? Absolutely, but it is still relatively small, and it varies vastly across the country. So, you're in California, that's a completely different state in terms of the rate of adoption compared to other parts in the country like the Midwest or the South or even the East. Obviously, they're a little bit further along as well, like DC. So there's definitely this discrepancy and this push, but consumers are not quite there yet. And there's several challenges that are getting in the way. And the dealers that are involved in this as well are a huge part of this, right? They want to be there to serve the customer and meet the consumer demand for EV, but they're just not seeing that just yet.
Well, and I want to get back to that in a minute and talk about how all of this affects the economics of car dealerships. But before we do, I want to get Mark's take on the headwinds, on what it is that we're facing that is slowing up the EV demand and maybe creating some roadblocks that will be impossible to overcome.
Well, in a word, reality, the reality of physics, electrical engineering, material supply chains, the reality of consumer preferences, consumer conveniences, the preciousness of our personal time matters to people, and capital matters to people. Money matters. So to amplify what Jamie said, I will add one point and one mild disagreement with the language choice. Jamie, you know what I'm gonna, she'll appreciate this. Yes, they are, EV sales were accelerated from zero. Any statistical growth from zero is rapid. It's utterly irrelevant that there's high growth rate in early phases of something. It just is completely meaningless. So the language, not Jamie's language, but I'm saying this to be mildly critical of our accepting the framing that's in the general media and the hyperbole of the advocates of its accelerating pace of EV sales. It completely misses the core point, which Jamie did correctly make there, a small share of new vehicle sales. But let me amplify this with another language subtly that automobile dealers know full well. When a person buys a new vehicle for themselves, it's often a used vehicle. In fact, 75% of all vehicles purchased each year in America, a new car to the owner, are used cars, previously owned cars in the nomenclature of the automobile world. So when you look at the actual percentage of vehicles purchased new to a human being, the citizen that wants a new vehicle or a newer vehicle or a first vehicle, the share that EVs comprise of that market is below 2%.
So, right. So it's an even smaller factor. And
tiny.
Your point is right. You know, when you go from 0 to 1, the numbers are in a different scale. But let me get back to one of the points that you raised about physics. So what are the immovable rocks here? What are the things that physics won't allow us to do when it comes to EV adoption?
Well, put differently, the physics have a consequence. It's what I'm sort of framing as the physics of money. The physics allow you to do a lot of things. It's just they have consequences. Storing energy in an electrochemical form as opposed to petrochemical form is very, very inefficient. Batteries have an energy density below wood. By density, I mean how much energy you store in a pound of stuff. So instead of a gasoline tank that weighs 50 or 60 pounds to give you several hundred miles of range, you have a tank that weighs 1,000 pounds. That has a consequence. It affects the kinds of tires you use, the range you have, and the materials you use upstream. So there's a massive call on materials, cadmium, lithium, nickel, cobalt, steel, aluminum, to build an EV and copper to build one compared to a conventional car. That's unavoidable in the chemistry that we have, we know how to build. So that's a physics problem that's not solved, you just deal with it. The other physics problem is the ability to move energy from A to B, which is filling a tank, filling a battery. Those are dictated by the physics of chemicals and the physics of electricity. Roughly speaking, moving energy as electricity into a fuel tank is 10 times more difficult, measured in either flow terms, how fast I can move it, or size terms, how big the fueling hose needs to be. It takes 10 times longer, or it takes 10 times the physical infrastructure to get the same benefit. Or this is a different way of saying, when you refuel a battery, it takes, in a quote supercharger, 30 to 40 minutes. When you refuel a gasoline tank for the same range, it takes 3 to 4 minutes. You could do a battery, some classes of batteries, in 3 or 4 minutes. Very difficult to design batteries that can tolerate the electrical influx, the heating, in theory, but it would require a copper cable to connect to the car that would weigh 100 pounds. In other words, 10 times the weight of a 10-pound fuel hose you use. And the infrastructure behind it, transformers, wires, that cost 10 times more than the physical infrastructure for gasoline. That's just locked into the physics of electric flows.
Which obviously is going to put a damper to some degree on the speed of adoption. But let's get into the physics of money when it comes to dealerships.
Right. Well, I think just to carry on, and from what I can understand, the auto industry in the United States particularly is very, very much dependent on the sales of trucks. I mean, the F-150.
SUVs, yeah.
And SUVs. And Mark and I were on a show with a dealer from Michigan who was talking about having essentially a lot full of Ford Lightnings. That it seems that, would it be true? And Jamie, are you seeing this in the marketplace that EV sedans may be doing better than EV trucks? We were told the other day that, like, the Cybertruck, which I have to say is the ugliest car I've ever seen.
You're talking about the Tesla Cybertruck. Yeah.
Beauty's in the eyes of the beholder, baby.
Right, exactly.
But I mean, it seems to me that what might work for a small little putt-putt may not work for a big rig or even a heavy truck. Is that what you're seeing in the marketplace, Jamie?
Well, consumers definitely like their SUVs and trucks. So I think the car manufacturers are trying to find ways to adopt EV technology to the types of vehicles that consumers want to buy.
Yeah, well, okay, that which makes sense, right? If you're a retailer,
Right.
you're going to sell the products that people are going to want to buy. The question I have about this particular class of retailer, known as the auto dealer, is that if you look at their business models, the bulk of their profit comes historically from service revenue, right? It comes from taking your car in every quarter or whatever it is, and getting it worked on. I guess the question is, are dealers worried about the continued viability of that business model as EVs come in? Are they going to need less service? Are they going to need more service? How do they view that?
I think it's definitely a concern that I hear them talking about. EVs have fewer moving parts, so there's not going to be oil to change. There's not going to be filters to change. It's still going to have brake fluid. It's still going to have coolant. It's going to still have power steering fluid that's going to need to be maintained. And of course, EVs still have tires, and the weight of the battery, increases the vehicle weight of the car. So there's more weight and wear and tear on those tires. So I think generally speaking, there's concern that there might be less items to maintain, but some of those items might actually end up being more costly to maintain in the long run. So I think it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out. And if I'm a dealer too, if you're not selling tires and in the tire business, definitely make sure you're thinking about that, because you don't want your customer going down, the street to the other tire place where they might not even know what the appropriate tires are to put on the car.
You can see a realignment potentially in who owns what, or you could see a potential M&A or private equity play in those industries to kind of change the ownership structure of who owns the big tire stores, for instance, as a possibility.
And
then that's very interesting. Go ahead.
Yeah, and then going back to, EVs in a truck or SUV platform, I think one of the other challenges is that EVs in general are more expensive. So that's a harder affordability, level for a consumer to reach. So if it's sedans and it's a little bit more affordable that way, obviously that's a huge factor going in. And I think from a perspective from adopting EVs, a lot of times it is someone's second car, or if it's a family, it's their third car. So they also have to have the funds to be able to make that additional purchase, because they don't necessarily want to take that EV for a road trip, because I know I don't want to have the anxiety about figuring out where I'm going to charge it up. And if I do get to a charging station that I've mapped out well in advance, and I get there and there's a line, then I'm sitting and waiting. Or if I get there and it's not working, because the latest study I've seen is only 1 in 5 are actually functional right now, that's a huge concern. And it could ruin your vacation, or it could ruin your trip. And that's
Getting
I'm
stuck
definitely not
on a
up for
corner
that
in Winslow, Arizona seems like the coming back to my brain as a frame from a song.
I just should point out that, and Jamie, you're right about all those things. But one thing that dealers will learn, and they'll learn what Hertz learned. And of course, you all understand what happened to Hertz. They bought lots of EVs, and it led to the firing of the CEO. And what they discovered wasn't a consumer problem, because for most rental cars, the distances most people drive are well within the range of the battery. So they don't have to worry. I rented a Hertz EV several times recently because I wanted to see how their system worked. Their problem was the maintenance cost was higher. So the trope that's been put out, the claim in the literature put out by the advocates, is that they have fewer parts and they're simpler and they have lower maintenance, and it's going to mean fewer jobs for the automakers and less maintenance. Neither of those things are true. They do not have. They do not result in less labor to manufacture them, nor are they lower cost to maintain. It's a complexity swap. In an EV, your complexities reside in the electronics and the battery. In a car, conventional car, the the complexities reside in the internal combustion engine and transmission. The complexity swap doesn't make one cheaper. In fact, it will probably take a decade before EVs, in fact, are lower maintenance than conventional vehicles in all-in cost terms, because there's a learning curve to getting these complex systems made more reliable. So it is the trope that's out there, and I know that manufacturers, God bless them, like to promote that feature, but it's actually not true.
Well, it's interesting you should say that, Mark, because we have this kind of, or at least I will confess to having a little bit of an old school bias when I think about the cost of making something, the bill of materials for something. I tend to think of the hardware, right? And I think, if I'm not mistaken, making an electric motor is cheaper than making an internal combustion engine. Is that right?
No, not necessarily. So first of all, most of the EVs that people want have 2 electric motors, not one. The little Chinese cars have one, and small cars. The electric motors themselves are very expensive, but it depends on the internal combustion engine. Making a steel and cast iron internal combustion engine has become an extremely efficient, low-cost process. Making copper wound electric motors at super high efficiencies is a very difficult, complex, and expensive process.
But isn't that just an experience curve problem?
No, it's not.
Okay. I mean, because you're talking 100 years of making internal combustion
and we've been
engines.
making electric motors as long. So the Pearl Street Station dates the late 19th century. There are electric motors that were built then that are still running today. Electric motor technology is extremely mature. It's deep into its learning curve. You're right. The hyper-specific different classes of electric motors made for EVs are on something of a learning curve. But the issue is not the electric motor, but they're very reliable. Electric motors are reliable, but modern internal combustion engines are also very reliable. People generally don't take their cars in for tune-ups anymore. They drive them till the end of the lease or their ownership cycle. If you're lucky, they might change the oil. They're actually designed, and of course, engineers know this, but auto dealers don't like to point this out. They're designed to run almost indestructibly, even if you're dumb enough not to change your oil. I mean, it's astonishing reliability in internal combustion engines. They'll run for hundreds of thousands of miles with de minimis maintenance. Things just don't break much anymore. So yeah, they're on a learning curve, but that's exactly the same learning curve. The thing that's different are the power electronics, which are complex and expensive. They also fail. They're machines. They happen to be silicon machines. And the battery itself, which is a machine with cooling systems, safety systems, and something on the order of 5,000 to 10,000 welds in it, multiple cells, usually thousands of them. So the electrochemical degradation, the electrical problems in batteries, very difficult for dealer mechanics to diagnose. Manufacturers are getting better at designing batteries for transparency. But if you're a dealer, you don't have any control over that. What you've got is a vehicle for which the battery is the single most expensive component. If something goes wrong, if you're the consumer, it means your vehicle has been written off.
Well, this brings us to a question of people working at car dealerships. Car dealerships as a class, as a NACS code.
Or in the whole repair infrastructure.
Right. I mean, this is one of the largest employers of working class people in the United States. So what is going to happen to those people as EVs come in? Are the dealers thinking they're going to need fewer and fewer people, Jamie? Are they thinking that it's just a complete retraining? Are they just ceding responsibility to the OEM for battery maintenance? How do they view this?
Well, not even factoring in EVs, there is a severe technician shortage across the country at all of the dealerships. So that's a problem that the dealers and the OEMs are trying to work on to solve together. And then you add in the EVs, which have a different level of complexity and is completely new, that now this is an extra layer of challenge that they're going to have to overcome. The technician, who traditionally works with their hands and it's very hard labor, will not only have to do that, but will also have to have the knowledge needed to take care of those battery components, the computer systems, and that level of technology.
Interesting.
Jamie is right. I mean, I've done a lot of work in what are loosely called the skilled trades. I've several friends who own auto dealerships, and they talk, as Jamie said, about the challenge they have at all levels, whether it's working in the body shop, the paint shops, every level of employment in the dealership. The short people, short skills. They go out to high schools and try to convince people there's a great path for great incomes with reasonable skills training, and you don't have a huge debt at the end of at that point. But the shifting requirement for dealers has already happened because of especially of the so-called ADAS systems, the automated control systems that give you a computer-controlled braking, computer-controlled vision systems. Technicians are trainable. They're smart. I mean, these are not, in fact, they don't have a degree in math or physics, and electrical engineering is completely irrelevant. People are trainable, but I think it's a big lift for dealers where cars are going in general. I think this is my opinion, there's less than a 5% chance, I would put near zero, that EVs will have a material impact on dealers, except causing them to lose money because they have manufacturers pushing vehicles into their showrooms because of federal or state mandates. The challenge dealers are going to have is if you're in a state that says you can't sell an internal combustion engine, is you're going to have a lot of consumers who can't afford those vehicles or don't want them because they're not useful or they're too expensive. Because so it'll push the market into used cars because they'll be the only car they can register in that state. So if there's a disruption to dealers coming, it's going to be primarily if those states maintain those mandates, those bans, and force auto dealers to sell things that they weren't planning to sell, which is a lot more used cars, because it'll be the only thing you can license in those states. That's a huge disruption, and that disruption starts far sooner than the 2032 mandates, because manufacturers, not dealers, obviously plan 4 to 5 years out for production cycles. So if you back that up from 2032,
We're
3
almost
years
there.
from now, you got a big problem in a dozen states for the dealers that are thinking about what's coming down the pike, what they'll have available to sell, never mind maintain.
Yeah, we just bought a car recently. It happened to be a used car, a 2020. But yeah, when we talked to the salesperson, he kept saying we bought a hybrid. He said the hybrids go in about 10 seconds, and the EVs are a hard sell. What I wonder about is, why aren't we looking at the hybrid as a way to get us there faster, more flexibly, than forcing this new technology that really is particularly bad for anyone who doesn't have a garage and money?
Well, and let's throw this over to Jamie, because
Right.
she is just coming off of a 20-some-odd year career with Toyota, whose explicit strategy has been hybrid. So what's your sense on that?
So Toyota, they have this thing called the 1-6-90 rule. So basically it highlights that the minerals required for just one EV could instead produce 6 plug-in hybrid vehicles or 90 hybrid vehicles.
Wow.
So this approach maximizes resource utilization to reduce, overall emissions more effectively. So more people can do their part to reduce carbon, and if reducing carbon emissions is important to you, this is a great way to do it.
And so, what is the motivation for this sort of, if you will, this sort of EV obsession, where this is the only? I mean, I get emails from PR firms, and there are a whole bunch of them, funded by the environmentalists and their oligarch friends, and literally, we protest Toyota because Toyota is doing hybrids and not, and was not prioritizing EVs. And I'm thinking, what company in the world has probably reduced emissions more in the last 10 years than Toyota? I can't think of anybody. So, I think what I wonder about is this one of these situations where we're essentially not even really doing this thing to help the environment the fastest, but imposing something absolutely impossible and maybe even worse for the environment?
Well, the question answers itself, as given that Toyota's 1690 rule. For those who study this, it's beyond obvious that when you put a 1,000-pound fuel tank battery in a vehicle, that you're using a lot of materials. The quantity of materials is not well recognized. I did a study a few years ago that illustrated the fact that you have to mine about 250,000 pounds of the earth to make one battery, one EV battery. I apologize. Looks like I got interference noise in the background for you guys.
We don't hear it.
We don't hear it.
Oh, that's good news.
Yeah, don't worry about it. Keep going. We'll edit.
The answer to your question about why are automakers being pushed or adopting EV mandates or accepting them or being silent about it is obvious. It's about carbon dioxide emissions. The problem with the proposition is that the emissions reductions that come from using EVs are trivial or zero. And so the idea that you have no tailpipe emitting carbon dioxide is self-evident. But when an EV is parked, unlike a conventional vehicle, parked either being refueled or when it's being manufactured, parked euphemistically, that's when the EV emissions occur. So there's obviously emissions from the grid to charge the vehicle, but that depends on what grid you're on. You can be in a grid in Norway, which is all hydropowered, or a grid in France, which is 3/4 nuclear powered and have low fueling emissions. But all of them entail emissions to manufacture the vehicle that are unavoidable because of the massive quantities of materials. Again, 250,000 pounds of stuff mined per vehicle with heavy machinery and ground up. Roughly speaking, you lead to the emissions of 30 to 50 tons of CO2 per EV that comes to your driveway before you've driven it 1 mile. If you drove a hyper-efficient internal combustion engine, not a hybrid, just a conventional one, you wouldn't emit 50 tons of CO2 over the life of the vehicle. So in fact, in many fuel cycle scenarios, the EV will increase global CO2 emissions. For the few cases where it decreases it, the decrease is small and totally offset by the increased emissions that are occurring in countries like China, Pakistan, India, and Indonesia as they expand their combustion of coal to operate their economies. So to the extent to which we spend our money and force our consumers to spend extra money to buy a vehicle to cut CO2 emissions, we're having no impact on the planet because it's one atmosphere, none whatsoever. And the extent there's any, and again, it's trivial, it comes at extremely high cost. EVs are a lot of fun to drive just on their merit. A lot of dealers will sell lots of EVs, but to Jamie's point, they'll sell them in very specific markets to specific kinds of customers who have more wealth than the average car buyer. There's tens of millions more EVs that'll get built and sold, and Toyota will sell lots of them because they're a great automaker, and Tesla will sell lots of them because they're now a really good automaker too. But
let me ask you a question about the ideal state. So if you're a scientist and an engineer, if you had to wave a wand and say, here's the technology or the type of vehicle that we really ought to replace existing internal combustion engines with, would you say, don't bother? Or would you say, hey, this other alternative technology is the way to go?
Well, if I had a magic wand, I'd say don't bother, for the exact point I made, that even if you assumed that we use no oil for consumer vehicles, we switched all vehicles to magic unobtainium, and they were perfect zero-emitting vehicles with a 1-ounce battery, it would reduce global oil consumption by less than 10%. That's today's global oil consumption. The future oil consumption will be even less. So the actual impacts are trivial. So it's wasted money. But the question you're asking is different. If you ask from an engineering physics perspective, what's the optimal way to propel people and goods on the ground? And the air is very different, with minimal oil use, because that's really what people are trying to cut back on, oil use. 98% of all goods and people are moved by burning oil. Most of the other 2 percentage points is ethanol, in Brazil and here, and a trivial amount from batteries. So what's the it's hybrid. Yeah, you said it exactly correct. It's not the plug-in hybrid. What hybrids do is optimize the thermodynamic efficiency of an internal combustion engine. And by doing that, you can have a very significant impact on oil use. It's not trivial. It's much bigger in economic terms than it is with EVs, because to Jamie's point, you can use the same materials, get 90 hybrids, and those 90 hybrids will actually be used, will actually save oil for consumers. And as the cost of the batteries comes down slightly, it's not going to come down a lot. And more importantly, as the cost of the power electronics comes down, and that's what's really a significant share of the costs in manufacturing hybrids, the very complex power control systems. Those costs are silicon costs. Those do come down on a very rapid learning curve compared to chemical and materials costs, because you're working in the fun world of semiconductors, which has a very different cost curve.
But
I think
go ahead.
Just to add about the future, Toyota's been working on hydrogen fuel cell technology for 3 decades. They feel that is really the future of reducing carbon in the most effective way for the long term. So
I know they have, and they're the best at it. They've made the best hydrogen engines and fuel cells of anybody probably on the planet. But I'll just weigh in with my physics observation. There's an acronym, WOT, waste of time. But it's great. It's great PR. God bless Toyota for doing it. There's not going to be any widespread use of hydrogen in cars because it's a really bad fuel. It's expensive to make. It has a carbon footprint, and all the paths to make, quote, low carbon hydrogen are staggeringly expensive, just breathtakingly expensive. But
they're working on it they're working on it for heavy duty transport first. So I'm excited to see where that goes.
Right. That's what we're seeing here in Southern California is a move toward improving the truck infrastructure for hydrogen trucks.
Yeah. But I would just, this is my opinion, and people will do it and they'll spend money on it. Complete waste of time. If you want to reduce emissions from trucks, you chase more efficient truck engines. Diesel engines have they're not at the end of their thermodynamic efficiency. There's been a continual learning curve in improving the thermodynamic efficiency of diesel engines. We will buy 10 times the emissions reductions per dollar by promoting more efficient diesel engines in trucks than by buying hydrogen for big trucks. But it's the only place hydrogen makes sense. Compressed natural gas makes sense in big trucks, by the way. It's a much better way to use methane than turning it into hydrogen. But yeah, look, governments are going to do crazy things, and the politics are what they are. If you have to find a compromise, the compromise might be around hydrogen and big trucks. Well, I would say, go girls, that's nice, but it will make zero difference to the planet's future carbon burden, and it will have no impact on the computer models in terms of their forecast for temperatures, but it will make trucking more expensive, which I think is a bad thing. I mean, that's just generally speaking, we move everything on trucks to get to consumers.
Well, and then looking at the economics of truck ownership, most trucks are owned and operated by
private individuals,
by private sector individuals.
Yeah, and here in California,
people.
Predominantly Hispanic working class people.
You got it.
In the Bay Area, a lot of Asian working class people.
You bet.
Right. So please go out, and we're going to ask you very nicely to buy a $500,000 new truck to replace the truck that you've already paid for and still are paying off. Yeah, no, it's the numbers don't foot.
But so here's because we can't let you go before dealing with the politics, which you sort of got us into.
That's the third rail, Joel. Come on.
But you got two things, and I wondered, Jamie, if this is going through the dealer world now too. You have the Chevron decision, and what that will limit the ability of the bureaucracy to do things, because I've always felt like you would never get the EV mandates through Congress. There's just no way that would ever pass, and I don't even think it would pass the California legislature. And then to make it even more unpleasant, the chance that perhaps Donald Trump will be president, and since the EV mandates are not a product of the of congressional action, but of administrative action, doesn't that sort of throw the whole game up in the air? And I mean, if I was a dealer and I've been
If I were
investing,
NADA, I would be just salivating at the opportunity to change course.
so is this being discussed, Jamie, among dealers about there could be a change in direction? We already know in Europe. I just came back from London. That there's already pushing back on the EV mandates, particularly from Germany.
So,
But are dealers
Yeah,
talking
our dealers
about the
talking
fact
about political action, basically. Is that high on their agendas as you talk to them?
yes, very much so. Every state has a, dealer state association.
Yeah.
So there is a lot of advocacy and campaigning going on in favor of supporting the franchise dealer network and making sure that these mandates aren't coming when they're not realistic and they're way too aggressive. There's also many dealer groups that are rallying together and going, on Capitol Hill to talk and try to get in front of the leaders in the states and the government officials to get them to understand their side, because it's completely misunderstood. So they are doing a tremendous amount of work to do that. And I don't think people realize how much these dealerships contribute to their communities.
Exactly.
And they employ over 1.1 million people throughout the US. So if
and
that
they're big in the
network,
tax base too.
right, and if that
Yeah.
were to crumble in any way, that would be devastating to our country and to our communities and all of those people. So, the dealer franchise network exists for a reason. They do many, many positive things for the consumer and for our communities.
I think, you've framed it diplomatically, but it is the right framing. It's a big industry. Automobiles are critical to civilian economy, personal freedoms. I mean, it's one of the most remarkable inventions of the last 200 years is the personal car. It gives economic flexibility and velocity to the country, and it provides jobs directly. It enhances jobs indirectly. I mean, everyone in the world who doesn't have a car wants a car, and the dealers are at the sort of the epicenter of that transaction. And obviously, they've been doing a good job. You probably know my friend Jeff Pohanka, who has been very vocal but diplomatic, like you, about essentially the need for governments, state and national, to understand what they're doing. Not, if you're a dealer, as he put it to me, I'll sell what people want to buy. I sell stuff. I'm good at selling people things they would like to own and making their lives better. And if an EV were better, great, it'll get there. But mandating things, which is where we are now, at a velocity that is unachievable. This is me saying, and not the dealers, but dealers know what they look at consumer reactions. It's an unachievable velocity, even if you agree that we should have lots more EVs in the future. And even if you believe they cut emissions significantly, they don't. But we could have that, or even if we agreed on that, you have to recognize the nature of what you're tinkering with and what you're disrupting, because it affects people's lives. And so I think the dealers are doing it the right way diplomatically. It's going to be different in every state. The velocity, they're going to face the challenge, including in California, which is California led the way with the ban on new vehicle sales that can be involve an internal combustion engine. This is not speculation. This will be a complete disaster for consumers. It will be terrible for dealers, because they're going to have to think about what do they get that consumers can buy because they need cars. When your old car is worn out, if you can't buy a brand new car, you have to buy a new previously owned car. Shifts everything. It changes the supply chain for parts, because you're going to need lots more parts and a lot more maintenance as you push cars beyond their sort of normal lifespan, let's call it. So if I'm a dealer, I'm very worried about what's going on politically, because something that I'm involved in, which is providing a vital product and service to consumers, has become a political football. No one wants that. If you're the business, you don't want to be a political football. You want to just do your job and accommodate OSHA regulations for safety in your workplace, those kinds of things.
So maybe before we let you go, this has just been a fascinating discussion. So we're going to put you on the spot and make you even more uncomfortable.
You-
5
you
years
can't-
from
you-
now,
Jamie or me? I'm perfectly
we'll start with Jamie, and then we'll inflict it on you.
okay.
So Jamie, what trajectory do you see in the industry next 5 years? Given these political factors as well.
Well, in terms of EVs, I think it's going to be it's going to grow very slowly. I don't think we're going to see anything revolutionary in the next 5 years. I feel the dealer sentiments align with that. I know about 50% of them think that it's not really going to become part of their normal day-to-day until the next 5 to 15 years. And then another 30% don't think it's going to be until 15 years plus. So I know that we're going to, keep going in this direction. And my hope is the adoption of hybrid vehicles will continue to increase and actually increase at a faster rate.
Yeah. Jamie and I agree. I mean, hybrid adoption is already accelerating. It's going to accelerate more. Plug-in hybrids will accelerate beyond EVs shortly because there's a very big logical market for a plug-in hybrid. Wealthy families with 2 to 3 cars, having one car that's always charged overnight, really easy, convenient, and people have wealth. It's in a wealthy country. We have more cars than there are licensed drivers. This is great, but I think Jamie's exactly right. I would put it in this more stark terms: the insane narrative that there's some, and I think, as you could tell, I think it's an insane narrative that we're going to have a wholesale rapid acceleration shift away from conventional cars. This is just like going from a horse and buggy to the car in the first place. Everybody's seen that analogy. No, it's not. This is equivalent of changing the food for a horse and calling that a revolution and having the food be more expensive. So there may be people who like the horse that's prettier with more expensive feed, but it's still a horse. It's still a car, whether it's got a battery or not. All the features that matter to people are less related to the fuel and more related to convenience and cost and features. Some EV features people love, the blinding acceleration, it's silent. But I think Jamie's nailed it. I think the dealers know this. The danger, the risk, the political risk for the politicians pushing mandates is non-trivial. And I think I'll give the dealers credit because it can't come from the oil industry because they don't care. I'm going to tell you this. There's not enough, you're not going to replace enough oil to matter to the oil industry. They could care less whether people buy EVs. So putting this on big oil, opposing it, it's not big oil. This is dealers quietly, properly reminding legislators and policymakers how important these vehicles are to people and how difficult it is to effect the change that they're claiming they want. So it's a real service to the country. So I hope it blows up in their, and I say the advocates face, without a lot of violence, because I mean consumer blowback and unhappiness.
Well, I can't think of an example in society that underscores the reality of unintended consequences
Got that right.
better than this particular particular situation. And so, given the fact that we're a podcast that focuses on unintended consequences, I want to thank you for bringing that out for us. And thank you for being guests on the Feudal Future podcast. We're going to see how all of this plays out, and we look forward to having you back for a future episode.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.
The Feudal Future.